Hello. I wanted to talk today about a play that I saw just a couple weeks ago. I've got some of the notes coming up online. That's why I kind of delayed the video about this. It's called The Cherry Orchard, Anton Chekhov. Um, Two famous actors. One of them is Ian McKellen's in it. He actually plays a smaller role, which is sort of this old senile um, servant in the house. And then there's this guy, Martin Shaw. I'm actually a big fan of his. Uh, he was in George Gently. He was in John Deed. They're more mystery uh, TV shows, but he was on a miniseries that I really enjoyed back in the 80s called The Last Place on Earth, where he played Captain Scott, who was a British Antarctic explorer who went through a lot of troubles in the South. So I'll leave it at that. But he was phenomenal in it. So anyway, um, I suppose that we should talk about this. I'm not going to go through the whole plot, but essentially, I talk about the setup of this. Is that essentially um, you have this aristocratic woman called Lubov Ranevsky. Now, in the play here, they have her as Renevskaya. I understand that they feminize the last names, unlike us here in the western part of the world, where we just get whatever our father's last name was. Even if your name is Johnson, you can still be a woman, but it would be Johnsona or something like that. So anyway, she Renevskaya. It says here. So anyway, she is this landowner. You would call her an aristocrat by old terms. And if you know a little bit about Russian history, in the very early 1860s, uh, Russia went through a form of class reform where essentially they'd freed serfs, which is a bit weird because we think of that as a very medieval thing. Uh, I think of serfs as something in the time of like Robin Hood or something like that, where um, you're really tied to land, and that was true. But they were so backwards that this continued until the mid 1800s, and this woman owned a large piece of property, um, and it had a cherry orchard in it, hence the name Cherry Orchard. The cherry orchard's kind of this. I guess you would call it symbolism. I'm not going to go too much into symbolism because I'll leave that for the English professors who like to read everything into everything. Um, and the thing is that the cherry orchard is a symbol of essentially of improper use of the land, because this woman owns hundreds of acres of land, and then she runs off to France when her husband and her son die, both within a month of each other, and she just can't cope with it. So she leaves uh, her eldest daughter, who I think is adopted. Her name is Barya, um, and she leaves her in charge of it. And they've got no money. Essentially, they've got all this land and no income. And so she runs off to France, screws around, falls in love with some guy who mistreats her, basically just uses her for her money. She's had enough. She comes back to Russia to live on her property, and she finds out that she just doesn't have any money. In fact, like there are mortgages on the property. She can't even pay the interest on the mortgage, let alone even tackle the principal. And she comes back and she finds this guy, what's his name? Lopatkin, played by Martin Shaw. And essentially, he is this businessman. It never really says what he is in business for or with. Essentially, he used to be a peasant on the property. And he has grown up. He has made himself into a very wealthy man. And he looks at her with a lot of pity, that here is a woman who treated him very well. And so an aristocrat who treated her peasants very well, obviously there was an order, like aristocrats up here, little people down here. And now that this, this act of parliament, or I think it was called a Duma back then, um, essentially just totally disrupted the whole process and just left people to go this way and that way. And he says, "Look, I know you're hemorrhaging cash here. Um, why don't you drop down this cherry orchard?" And she loses her mind. And he says, "No, listen to me. Drop it down. You're not earning anything off of it. You can set up little villas." There's essentially a working class coming on. This play was written, I think, or first put on in 1905. I think it was the last play that he had ever written. It actually came out after he died, I think, of tuberculosis. A doctor dying of tuberculosis. And so he says, "Look, I can help you survive, but you're going to have to change things here. You're going to have to chop down these cherry orchards, put up these little villas, let the middle class come out here, spend their money for a week, or if you want to do some sort of timeshare, obviously that's probably a newer concept, but basically he's an innovator. He's sort of business idea, an entrepreneur. Just say, come on, I'm trying to help you survive. You've always been kind to me. It's now time for me to return the favor." And she just won't listen to it. And so her brother is there, brother who had not left the village, and he didn't live on the property, but he comes in there and he won't hear of it either. They're too emotionally tied to the fact that they have been owned. This thing has been in their family for many, many, many generations, several hundred years, and they just can't fathom the idea that just strangers are going to live on their land for a week at a time. It's a very strange concept if you think about it. But they're going to, this is my land. Why are they going to be on my land? They're going to give you money for it because they want to live. They want to live like you for a week, maybe. And so you have this out of touch brother and sister who are aristocrats, very kind people to everyone, but totally out of touch. Her brother Gayev is basically obsessed with billiards. He's always like sort of mocking little billiard moves. He calls his shots, which have nothing to do with the plot. It just kind of shows that he's a little bit not all there. And so essentially the daughter is just sort of the elder daughter was left running the place, and obviously since the money wasn't there, he sort of ran into ruins. The younger daughter is only 17 years old, and she's sort of left to be the caretaker, the emotional caretaker of her mother, who just starts crying for random reasons, flashbacks about the boy who died, and just losing her. She's going to be the last one owning this property, which is, you don't want to be the one, the one son who ends up killing the business or selling out the business in a family business. It's a really interesting. It's sad, but it's funny. It's one of those plays where you can't tell if it's a sad drama or a comedy. And it's interesting that obviously there's some things missing in the play because they are very Russian things that you just can't translate into English. I understand this, but you can kind of tell that there was something missing because they inserted something that was very sort of a cultural touchstone in English. An English audience is that Lopatkin is played with a very heavy Yorkshire accent. While Ranevskaya is played with a very sort of posh accent. Obviously, Yorkshire accent's not very, very posh. It's a fun accent. It's really cool. But it ain't posh. It's very folksy, very grammar's not always on, but it have very clever mannerisms. It has its charm about it, but is not aristocratic at all. And you can even see that in more modern things like Downton Abbey. Downton Abbey is actually set in Yorkshire, and all the people who who are in the kitchen, the footmen. They all have very heavy Yorkshire accents. Uh, while the family, obviously the mom is American, but the other family have very posh accents, sort of inferring that they did not grow up around that area, that they went to boarding schools, or the girls might have gone to a girls' school, then a finishing school, or something like that. It's a very interesting play in the sense that the interplay between the classes is not as it's not as it's not as bad as you would expect, because you think about this. This is 1905, early, like, turn of the century Russia. Obviously, within 12 years of this, there's going to be a massive revolution that's going to destroy the country. There's going to be a civil war, and then there's going to be one of the worst dictatorships any country has ever seen, ever. And it's all based on class problem. In this case, it's almost like Lopatkin is what you would call a kulak in the sort of Leninist, or sort of Russian Soviet nomenclature. Is that he, the peasant who can barely read and write. He can't speak really nicely, but he's really good at business. Obviously, he's so good that he ends up later buying the whole property at auction because no one else can afford it, and he just kept outbidding anyone around, and he was the last man standing at the auction. So he becomes the owner of this, and it totally destroys Lubyov and her brother Gayev, and obviously the children, even the servants. What's her name? Sorry, I have a Yasha, which is sort of the main maid of the house, who kind of falls in love with Lubyov's manservant who followed her to France. She sees him as worldly, but he's just like, this place is just like, it's just peasantville. It's just a bunch of hicks. And Fears, who's played by Ian McKellen in this, you actually wouldn't recognize him because he has this big bushy beard, he has a bowler hat on, and he largely mumbles everything, or it has nothing to do with it. It's almost like he's like Grandpa Simpson, who just talks about things that no one else in the room is talking about, and he does it really well. It's comedy, he is definitely not what he's known for, Ian McKellen, but it is really hard to become a comic character in a play that's really kind of a downer. When you think about it, it's really hard to pull off comedy, and he does it. He's just a phenomenal actor. And I would kind of say like this: look, the student in this, his name is Peter Profimov. He is. It's hard to say that he would be something like a communist revolutionary. He was the tutor for the son who died before Renevskaya left. And so he's always been in town. He's the eternal student. He just can't finish school. And he's full of these big ideas that are very abstract. And that kind of puts him at odds with Lopatkin, because Lopatkin is very, business oriented. He doesn't have time for abstract. He's very focused on the here and the now, making real, tangible plans. Obviously had an eye on the property, found the money, bought it. He's very down to earth. And these are the people who were hunted down and killed like animals in the Soviet times, because that's what communists do. They're murderers. If they haven't murdered yet, they're give them an excuse. But and I would say that this is not about this. But you can kind of, if you know enough about Russian history, at least in that sort of turn of the century, that there was a peasant revolt around this time, or a very working class revolt. People whose family lived as serfs for hundreds of years suddenly given their freedom, and they don't know what to do with themselves. Should we stay on the farm? Should we go to the city? If we go to the city, there's no work because they actually hadn't industrialized at that time. So you had a bunch of people sitting around not doing anything. And actually, Profimov talks about this. It's like these people need to get to work. They need something to do in order to have a stable, happy life. You can't sit around and just talk idly about things. You need to do things. And the only guy who actually does that in this play, Lopatkin, is seen as a villain, which is very bizarre. He's like, yeah, this is the guy that you should be sort of maybe not mimicking in his personality, but what he does is he's getting things done. He's creating jobs. He's saving properties. He's creating wealth. This is everything that a capitalist wants to, and obviously that's why the communists would hate a guy like that, because he's an actual, enabling the capitalist system. But you can kind of see the communist, I would say the communist ideas sort of lurching in the wings here. You can kind of see it poking its head out really at the corners, and especially in Profimov, where he won't come out and say what he wants. He talks a lot about nothing, which is probably what I'm doing a whole lot of. But you get this idea that nobody in this story actually is willing to come to terms with the way things are. Renevskaya and Gayev, they're just totally out the lunch. I think intellectually they understand what's going on, but they're just in total denial. The daughter, Barya, she's doing all she can to save it, but inevitably it's just, what's the phrase, rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. It's an impossible task, and it's a fruitless task. Young daughter, Anya, has fallen in love with Profimov mostly because he's very intelligent. He's a very nice guy. He's full of big ideas and just won't get down to what he actually wants to do, or hasn't even figured that out yet. Something that many people can kind of we can sympathize with. And there's the neighbor. I think the guy who steals the play is actually, it's usually always a secondary character. There's a guy named Pishin, and he's their neighbor, and he's also a rich guy, and he's even worse in denial about things. He always ends up landing on his feet. He's always behind in paying his mortgage on this massive property that he does nothing with. And he just comes up finding money. He's kind of annoying because he begs money off of people, and then suddenly some guy finds clay on his, some special kind of clay on his property, and he's in the money for the next 20 years. And you kind of like the rich people in this because they're very, very sweet people. They really do care about each other and everybody in the play, and they're actually the only nice ones to Firs, the old servant who was longing for the days of when he was a peasant, because everything made sense. You are and there is something comforting to having everything decided for you, where you don't have to do anything other than what's your duty, and your duty is, okay, I'm going to serve my master. And master's duty is to look out for everybody else. Everybody's doing their duty, but the whole legal system and the whole class system has been totally thrown out of whack. You just don't really, it just can't work the way it used to work. And you have a guy like, I guess I'll go through one guy, Yasha, is Renevskaya's footman. And he's a peasant. He is kind of clever, but wants to be very cool. He wants to be, and he's very impressive to a girl like Nyasha. She's just sort of, he's lived in France. He walks around wearing a tuxedo or those footman outfits. He's very, he's something else. And essentially he gets bored of her because she's always going to be a peasant and he wants something even higher. So you have all these people trying to climb a ladder and only one person can actually do it. So I thought it was a really interesting play. It's kind of depressing because you know what comes after this. And it was funny. There's a big party that they hold the night of the auction. This is so typical of rich people, is that instead of running around trying to save, I would call them not rich people, like aristocratic people, um, instead of trying to save their property from foreclosure or, going up on auction, they're having a party and they're getting wasted, and they don't have the money to throw this party yet. That's what they're going to do with it. And it's kind of sad, but that's what they do. You wouldn't expect them to do anything out of character. I really do recommend anybody look at it. There is a really good version of this, I think, on YouTube, where Renevskaya is played by Judi Dench. She's always really good. Anything she's in, she's really good. She's also another famous Shakespearean actor. And I think that's about it. So I will see you later, probably sooner than 2 months. Yeah.